introduce you to Andrew, and we can also introduce you to Annie, or maybe Andrew, you can do that when I finish. But Andrew is actually, I understand, very well known in New Zealand. He's a best-selling nonfiction writer, photographer, and designer with a special interest in helping make nature accessible to beginners of all ages. His guides to New Zealand's flora and fauna have established his reputation as one of the country's foremost writers of natural history for children and adults. He arrived in New Zealand from his native England in 1972 at age 20, and he spent the first 6 months living in a cave. And that's perhaps a practical reason for the subject of his first book, which was A Field Guide to the Native Edible Plants of New Zealand, published in 1981. Since then, he's written, over 40 nature books covering seashells, insects, spiders, birds, other animals, and plants. He's won numerous New Zealand book awards, including the Margaret May Medal in 2009 for his overall contribution to children's literature, and the Ashton Wiley Award in 2005. So to me, Andrew's book that I'll introduce in a minute, and his whole research on the subject of wayfinding the Polynesian islands, it's really, to me, it's the proper sequel to Thor Heyerdahl's Kon-Tiki. I don't know how many people were alive to read that book. It was really, it stirred me when I was young. It was published in 1947. I'm happy to say I'm a little bit younger than that. But Heyerdahl, drifted from Peru to across the Pacific Ocean for 4,300 miles and smashed into a reef in the Tuamotus. He was wildly popular for a really long time, but his whole thesis was that, the Polynesians were just sort of drifting around, and that they didn't have much sense about what they were doing in their world. And that theory has now been discounted, that the Polynesians started in South America and drifted west. So, and Andrew's going to cover all that, but my point here is I really want to see Andrew and Annie, who is a traditional navigator, I want to see more attention drawn to that, because it is so important to set the record straight. And his book should be as popular as Kon-Tiki. So The Pathway of the Birds was published in 2018 after 15 years in the making and has won 4 awards. I strongly recommend that all of you consider buying this beautiful book. I got it on Amazon practically overnight. You can buy it from the University of Hawaii Press, published it here. It's visual and thought-provoking, and it's a real delight. Buy it. So I don't know if I can really show you too well, but it's just filled with pictures. So, pictures and wonderful, wonderful text. So on the inside cover, which is totally comes off, is the same cover. And there's this fabulous map of the whole area he's covering. And it also shows you how enormous the Pacific Ocean and the Polynesian cultures are in terms of the islands. So I want to wish for both of you, may your appearance today kick off the wider acclaim your book and research so richly deserves. And Andrew, would you just be willing to give us a little bit of a hint about Annie as well? I don't have much biography on her, but if you could just give us a hint of what's to come when she speaks.
Okay, I'm happy to do that. Annie is a navigator. Well, she's crewed on some of these craft, traditional craft. In particular, one of her most impressive journeys was from New Zealand to Easter Island and back. And I'll be introducing her at the end of this. So I'll give you a bit of a background first, and then I'll come in at the end and hand you over to Annie. But she's a real treat because she's actually done what I'm talking about. In a way, she should be at the beginning rather than at the end, but that's how we've organized it. So I'll just get started now. I'll see if I can share my screen with you.
Yep.
Is that working?
You want to, yeah, you want to view slideshow. Perfect. That's it.
You can see that. Okay, very good. Okay. So I wanted to you over here. Okay, right. I just wanted to start with a bit of orientation of where we are in relationship to you. We're in Aotearoa, New Zealand, about 8,000 miles from you. And you can see there's a pretty big ocean between us, and that's the topic of the talk today. I just need to organize things a little bit on my screen because I'm going to have trouble seeing things. Okay. So I'd like to start by telling you about my own journey with this topic and how it began. It was during a visit to the Hawaiian Islands in 1986 that I pointed out the top plant to my guide and asked its local name. Ia ia, I was told. As a nature writer, I already knew an equivalent plant in New Zealand, which the indigenous Maori people called kia kia. I knew that a K in Maori is equivalent to a glottal stop in the Hawaiian language. Kia kia, ia ia. And it is not until that moment that I realized just how intimately linked the islands of Hawaii and Aotearoa, New Zealand, actually are. Given the enormous distance between them, 4,600 miles, most of it devoid of land, I was taken aback. It was a puzzle to me, and I wanted to solve it. Asking around as to what others thought of this conundrum, I found that most people seemed to believe that the Pacific was settled through a series of accidental voyages. So here is puzzle piece number one. The Pacific as a whole covers about 1/3 of the whole planet. It is the world's largest ocean. Indeed, the Pacific is so large that all the land on Earth, every single continent, can be fitted into it. Africa, Eurasia, North and South America, Australia, Greenland, and Antarctica. And yet, if we look at shared language, shared culture, and DNA, we find that most of the more than 1,000 islands scattered across this ocean were found and settled by a single race of people. It is quite some achievement, and yet one that is rarely acknowledged in our history books. This relative silence should be surprising, given the fact that as far back as 1778, when Captain James Cook reached the Hawaiian Islands, he had already seen enough of Polynesia to declare this whole region to be, certainly by far, the most extensive nation upon Earth. What Cook discovered was that this nation extends from the snow-capped peaks of Hawaii in the northern Pacific to Rappanui, or Easter Island, off the coast of South America, to the snowy mountains of Aotearoa, New Zealand in the south. These are the corners of the so-called Polynesian triangle that you see marked here in blue. However, the real story is bigger than this, for the speakers of Polynesian languages, those who possess its culture and DNA, actually extend much further west, along a chain of islands that stretch right out to Margi in the Western Pacific. It may be a surprise that a native speaker of Maori can readily understand the language of Margi with no need of an interpreter. So as the globe on the right shows, the true extent of Polynesia is more like a stingray or eagle ray. You could perhaps call it a triangle with a tail. What Cook also understood from language similarities was that the origins of these people could be traced back to Asia. So in his journal, he then asked himself this: how shall we account for this nation? spreading itself so far over this vast ocean? He asked this question in Hawaii, where I too was asking essentially the same question almost 250 years later. I should say that this fascination or question applies to Pacific cultures in general, although you will occasionally hear me refer more specifically to Polynesia, marked here in pink, and Micronesia, yellow. Do bear in mind that we're talking about a seafaring people, so should expect, and do find evidence of, considerable interaction and overlap. As I say, most people seem to believe that the original inhabitants of the Pacific were desperate rather than skillful, as depicted in this artist's impression by Charles Goldie of the arrival of Maori in Aotearoa, New Zealand, painted in 1898. You can still find this view reiterated in otherwise authoritative history books. In the eyes of their authors, fully laden voyaging canoes simply set sail into the unknown with no idea of where they were going. No skill involved, no prior exploration, and hence no need of navigational skill. Given the vastness of the region and the speed and thoroughness with which most of it was colonized, I, along with a growing number of people, question this, and I would like to use this presentation to show why. And the reason I'm doing this is that I believe that it matters, as it clearly does for people like Herb Carney. To help set the scene, I'd like to quote a work of historical fiction in which author Kate Mosse elaborates on a well-known maxim. She says, "History is written by the victors, the strongest, the most determined. Truth is found most often in the silence, in the quiet places. So let me take you now to some of these quiet places." This is Master Navigator Koloso Kaveia from Taumako in the Duff Islands in the Western Pacific. He continued all his life to practice the region's original non-instrument navigational skills, one of the very few members of an unbroken lineage of Polynesian wayfinders. He passed away in 2009 at an estimated age of 98. And here is Master Shipbuilder Tenanoa of Tarawa, an atoll in the Gilbert Islands, Kiribati. In 1976, he built and navigated a traditional craft named Taratai, keeping it on course by traditional means over more than 1,200 miles to reach Fiji. And here is Mau Piolug, a Micronesian master navigator of Satawal in the Caroline Islands. He is well known for the key role he played in the current renaissance of Polynesian navigation, when he trained Hawaiian sailors to find their way without any instruments of navigation from the Hawaiian Islands to Tahiti, also in 1976. Traditionally, the non-instrument navigational abilities of these wayfinders took a lifetime to learn. Mau Piolug, for example, was chosen to study as an apprentice navigator at the tender age of 4 or 5, when he would be placed in tide pools to feel the pull of the ocean. And this is Hawaiian Master Navigator Nainoa Thompson, who trained under Mau. It's worth noting here, though, Mau's proviso to Nainoa: "I cannot teach you what I know about navigation. You're too old. Send me your babies, and I will teach them." So how does this non-instrument navigation work? Everything you need to navigate is in nature, explains Mau's student. The question is, can you see it? Lacking maps or the written word, one must add to this the phenomenal powers of memory of the old wayfinders, reinforced through traditional voyaging chants. And this is where the bird watching comes in. The concept of using birds to find land can be traced back more than 4,000 years to a creation myth referring to Noah's Ark, the flood, and the return of his dove with an olive branch. symbolic or not, the concept of observing birds to find land is not limited to the Middle East. In the Western Pacific, the creation myths of Samoa refer to land birds and shorebirds flying over the ocean in search of dry land, a concept that presumably dates back here to when these islands were first discovered by people, a discovery that was evidently made some 3,000 years ago. In Samoa, the creator god Tagaloa is said to have sent his daughter Sina down from heaven in the form of a pigeon to locate the first dry earth. She visited the earth time and again until she finally discovered a rock rising from the crashing waves of the ocean. Here in the Western Pacific, the Pacific imperial pigeon, or lupe, regularly flies between the islands in search of seasonal abundances of fruit, islands that are shown in green on this map, and which correspond to the route by which West Polynesia is believed to have been settled. In another Samoan tradition, it was Tuli, or Tuli a Tagaloa, a son of Tagaloa, who flew down from the heavens and surveyed the surface of the earth looking for land. Tuli is the West Polynesian name for the Pacific golden plover. The story recurs in Tonga, where the same bird is called kiu. In the southern spring, around September, large flocks of these shorebirds are returning from their breeding grounds in the Arctic tundra to their southern feeding grounds on Pacific islands, along routes shown in purple on this globe. At this time of year, their return migration may have served as a clue to the whereabouts of land, not just in mythology, but also in real life. Discovery is one thing, but Polynesians were not just one-way voyagers. On this map of known pre-European maritime traffic, each arrow in this tangle of lines records an archaeologically attestable voyage. Grey is a transfer of basalt for making adzes. Black is obsidian. Green for greenstone. Brown for pottery or clay. Red for imported red feathers worn ceremonially as headdresses or in clothing. So Polynesians were more than explorers. They also voyaged back and forth, which of course implies a high level of navigational skill. This skill is also evident in the crops Polynesians carried. Without exception, they introduced crops to all of the islands they settled. Taro, yam, banana, sugarcane. It is a long list. Almost all these crops came from Asia, specifically the region on the left, marked by a pink triangle. However, there is a striking exception. That is the kumara, or sweet potato, whose genetic origin and indigenous name kumara can be traced to Ecuador. From here, its first transfer to the Pacific would have involved an open sea voyage of at least 1 month. So who distributed it from here to New Zealand, Australia, and Hawaii? Sorry, Easter Island and Hawaii. Some have credited Native Americans, yet offer no credible motive for them to head so far downwind into an unfamiliar sea loaded up with planting material. Polynesians, on the other hand, knew of their need of a drought-tolerant tuber and the location of the islands, and possessed the requisite navigational skill to reach them. These kumara voyages took place some 750 years ago, about 250 years before anyone elsewhere in the world would attempt an open sea voyage on this scale. These voyages are not well known, and you will find a lot more written about the exploits of the Vikings, for example. So it's worth making a direct comparison between these and the voyages of the Polynesians. From a Viking homeland in Norway, both Greenland and North America present enormous targets that were virtually unmissable. The courage and hardiness of the Vikings is beyond question, but when it comes to navigational skill, their target-finding abilities fall far short of those of the original wayfinders of the Pacific. In the Pacific, the target arc for Polynesian landfall was often tiny. Easter Island is a good example. It is about 3 times the size of Manhattan Island. It is distant from its nearest neighbor as Mexico is from Canada. To locate this island from Mangareva, the island from which it was evidently settled, the target arc is just 1/3 of 1 degree. You might wonder whether such navigation is even possible, and you might recognize who this is in the picture. However, in 2012, 2 traditional style sailing waka or waka haurua set out from New Zealand aiming to reach Easter Island without relying on navigational instruments. Jack Thatcher was the navigator and Anizal Black here was one of the crew. It turned out to be a long and difficult trip. They ran into 4 storms, had to ration food and water, and broke a steering paddle. It took them 4 months, but they found the island, then made their way back home to New Zealand the following year via Tahiti and Rarotonga. And soon you'll have a chance to hear directly from her about this. Navigation to a known destination like this, as opposed to its original discovery, relies largely on the position of the sun, and on a clear night at least, the stars. Of course, the stars track across the sky through the night just as the sun does during the day. So, how does this work? Pacific navigators noted that the point on the horizon at which each star rises or sets is fixed. So, for each course sailed, they would commit to memory a series of rising and setting stars. Here is an example where Vega and Altair are seen shortly after both have appeared on the eastern horizon, straddling the compass point of east-northeast. But what happens when you can't see the stars? The navigator still has his best friend, the real mainstay of maintaining course, the ocean swell. This refers to a specific type of wave that is generated from a distant source. These waves are relatively constant, rise and fall slowly, are smooth and rounded, and have a long interval between crests. This distinguishes swell from local wind waves, which tend to be temporary, shorter and steeper, and have breaking crests. Despite wave patterns moving across one another in different directions, each differing in height, length, shape, and speed, a true navigator can always distinguish the swell. It's no exaggeration to say that, by feel alone, the navigator can hold their course, even in sleep. Holding a steady course is just one aspect of navigation, for the wayfinder also needs to know where he or she is. One clue lies in the boundaries between major ocean currents. These are generally visible from lines of flotsam, such as this sargassum seaweed shown in the photo on the right. On this map, the meeting lines of major Pacific currents are highlighted in pink. Along these lines, an accumulation of drifting material will often attract fish seeking shelter, being chased by predatory fish, which in turn draw sharks and fish-feeding birds. These clashes of currents often bring nutrients welling up from the deep, providing sustenance too for surface plankton, which in turn attracts whales. From all this activity, a navigator can often spot these ocean marks from a long way off. In spring, another location clue is available from whale migration routes. Maori traditions concerning their ancestral voyages to Aotearoa, New Zealand, make reference to their canoes being accompanied by whales. And this is consistent with the course followed by humpback whales based in Tongan waters, making their own spring migration to summer feeding grounds in the food-rich waters around Antarctica. A trained navigator can find location clues in the taste and feel of the sea too. They may dip their arm in to test for cool flows or note subtle changes in the color of the water or its taste. Indeed, regional variations in the temperature and salinity of the top 1 to 2 centimeters of the world's oceans are sufficiently distinctive that they can be readily picked up from space, as depicted in these NASA satellite maps. Determining location naturally involves being aware of any telltale signs of land too, such as an increase in the number of flying insects landing on the sails and rigging, or an increase in the quantity of floating leaves, driftwood and seaweed, or a change in the cloud cover. High islands such as Tahiti or Aotearoa, New Zealand, often have a stationary cap of white clouds sitting over them. Such clouds may be seen from as much as 180 kilometers away, well before the land itself becomes visible. I should have given you that figure in miles, I'm sorry. However, much of the land traditionally settled by the original people of the Pacific is not high, but rather atolls like this. And yet here again, clouds can help. This is a satellite view of Anaa in the Tuamotus. The lagoon within is of such an intense turquoise that its presence may be picked up and distinguished from as much as 40 miles away, simply from sunlight reflecting this distinctive hue up onto the underbelly of the clouds sitting over them. Another clue is provided by the texture of the sea, namely subtle bounce-back waves and wave interference patterns. To learn how to read these, trainee navigators such as Maupiolug mentioned earlier may be left to float bodily in various locations around an atoll until they can distinguish position in relation to land purely by the feel of such wave signatures. Later, they learn to maintain this ability on board, even in semi-conscious states of sleep. Those last two views of atolls were from above, of course, but what does one look like from sea level? This is what you see from 10 miles away. If you can't see anything but clouds on the horizon, you're not alone. Due to this curvature of the earth, even the highest point, that is the tops of the coconut palms, lies beneath the horizon. So here is the next clue. More fish and an increase in bird numbers. In tropical skies, the most important indicators of land nearby are fairy tern, brown booby, and black noddy. All return to land at night, so their direction of flight is particularly significant at dawn and dusk, or when a parent bird is seen carrying a fish home in its beak. Birds were traditionally carried aboard canoes too. Those that could be trusted to either find land or to return to the canoe include frigate birds, rails, plovers, red-tailed tropic birds, herons, and sooty terns. At least 2 traditional Polynesian sea shanties honor this practice. In these, we are told, for example, how frigate birds would take their rightful place, poised upon the towering prow as the eyes of the navigator. So far, we have talked of maintaining course, establishing location, and ascertaining when land is near. But the genuine explorer also needs clues as to where to concentrate the search. The Pacific is huge, about 1/3 of the whole planet, as we said, and largely empty. Without clues, it would be like looking for a needle in the proverbial haystack. However, there are ways for the navigators to know from afar of the existence and whereabouts of undiscovered land. You can see evidence of this in traditional Polynesian voyaging chants, with lines like these from the Tuamotus. The black tern is my bird in whom my eyes are gifted with unbounded vision. From densely inhabited breeding colonies on predator-free islets and atolls, Sooty terns can forage for up to 300 miles or more, their presence often conspicuous within 25 to 50 miles of the colony. In season, sightings of these birds carrying fish provide a clear signal to voyagers as to where to find not only land, but chicks and eggs, a traditional source of food for many of the islanders. These birds were evidently important on Easter Island, for example. Here in this photo, we're looking out from the island across a birdman stone carving to the offshore islet of Motunui. Until the spring of 1867, a tradition remained in which competitors would swim out to this islet to retrieve the first sooty tern egg of the season, thus celebrating the bird's seasonal return, a phenomenon that may well be linked to the original discovery of the island. Indeed, based on subfossil evidence, this may be true of seabirds as a whole, for Rappanui was once the richest seabird island in the world. When the first people arrived on the island, the scene may have looked something like this. Although this sooty tern colony was filmed in the Indian Ocean, the clamor here is typical of predator-free islands. For much of the year, the birds are away roaming the ocean, but in spring will make their way back to these colonies, often in spectacular numbers. On Christmas Island, en route to the Hawaiian Islands, for example, the number of sooty terns recorded nesting at any one time is in the order of 15 million. These birds are also known as wide-awake terns, as they are active throughout the day and night, and loud, as you're about to hear. Some of the more remote islands that Polynesians managed to locate were even tinier than Easter Island. Dussie Atoll here is just 1 mile across. Its nearest inhabited neighbor to the west is the tiny island of Pitcairn, some 360 miles away. In the other direction, the next island is Easter Island, about 1,000 miles away. And yet, Polynesians found this atoll. We know this because of the presence of 2 humanly introduced lizard species and Pacific rats, or kiore. Because this tiny speck of an atoll lies en route to Easter Island, it probably served as shelter in a storm and as a source of provisions in the form of hermit crabs, chicks and eggs. Locating such an atoll would clearly have been a challenge, and yet an estimated 800,000 to 1 million seabirds do just that every year. Indeed, more than 90% of the world's population of Murphy's petrel are understood to breed here, despite migrating over enormous distances, as indicated by the brown area on the map. Evidently, the size of the target is no barrier to birds finding it, and the same is therefore true of keen observers of nature. Indeed, it was the density of birds in this region that led to the rediscovery of this atoll by the Portuguese explorer Pedro Fernandes de Quiros back in 1606. When seabirds congregate far from land and the flocks are on the move, their migration can provide another type of wayfinding clue. It is not unusual to see a single flock of sooty shearwaters, for example, with as many as 500,000 birds. During spring migration to their nesting sites, flocks of this enormous size can be seen way out in the Pacific, skimming the water en masse as they head for land. The total number of sooty shearwaters that are heading southwest in early October across the equator from their feeding grounds in the North Pacific to nesting sites in and around Aotearoa, New Zealand, is around 20 million. enough to suggest a sizable destination. Nowadays, these New Zealand breeding sites are confined to offshore islets, but subfossil evidence reveals that local colonies previously extended onto the mainland, which was then rat-free. For this reason, the present spectacle must be no more than a hint of the original one witnessed by the first Polynesians anywhere along their path. Some estimates put the original population at 10 times greater than nowadays. As their common name suggests, shearwaters fly close to the waves, so are easily seen by navigators. An alternative name, muttonbirds, alludes to their burrow nesting chicks being easily harvested for food, and for this reason we can be sure their seasonal movements were closely monitored right across the Pacific. Red dots on the globe here identify locations where the indigenous term for these birds, titi, is known, giving us some idea too of the region over which such information is likely to have been shared. As a result of satellite tracking, we can now see the big picture. In the course of a single year, these birds will trace a giant figure of 8 across the entire Pacific. On their return to New Zealand from the north, most pass across the equator in just 10 days at an average rate of 23 birds per second. These migrations are timed and routed to make maximum use of prevailing winds. So these spectacles almost certainly attracted the attention of Polynesian navigators who were similarly dependent on the winds. Indeed, most of the ancestors of New Zealand Māori are understood to have arrived from this same direction. With this return of the sun to the southern hemisphere, the warmth brings a change to the wind regimes, which attracts many other birds too. Indeed, the New Zealand region stands out on a global level when it comes to seabirds, a phenomenon that would have been more striking still in the early 13th century, before humans and their predatory creatures like rats first reached these islands. In the southern spring, several species of shorebirds are also crossing the Pacific along a similar course. Bar-tailed godwits, for example, which are known to fly to New Zealand from Alaska non-stop. However, unlike seabirds, these generally fly high up, passing over most of the Pacific at altitudes similar to those of light aircraft. Even so, a few have been seen flying low, especially from the Kermadec Islands onwards. The number of birds flying this route today is around 75,000, and although it is true that there are likely to have been many more in the voyaging era, estimates suggest no more than 500,000. In other words, potentially useful to the navigator, but on a much smaller scale than the migrating seabirds. With this return of the sun to the south come land birds too. Although the New Zealand long-tailed cuckoo only ever nests in New Zealand, its tropical range for the rest of the year is quite extraordinary. On this map, red dots denote islands where this New Zealand bird is seen in winter. To a navigator firmly grounded in the natural world, the seasonal arrivals and departures of what is clearly a forest bird could mean only one thing: a forested land lay to the south. Aotearoa, New Zealand. It is equally clear that Polynesians communicated with one another about this bird over most of this vast area. We know this from the region over which a single Polynesian term is recorded for it. That's the area delineated here by a wavy green line, a linguistic region that extends from the Caroline Islands in the west to the Marquesas in the east, a distance of some 4,500 miles. As we saw, evidence for the help received from birds and for a deliberate process of exploration and navigation can be found in creation myths and in traditional voyaging chants. These chants are considered relatively reliable sources of historical information due to their structured form, which tends to resist accidental alteration. Here are a few pertinent lines from one of them, lines that inspired the title of a book. The challenge is called Pathway of the Birds. Mine is the migrating bird, flying on even beating wings to lands revisited, ever searching out the road of the ocean. It is the road of the winds, coursed by the sea kings to unknown lands. Mine is the bird. I can tell you that that book took a long time to write, 15 years in all, during which time I got a chance to sail to many of these islands, to gaze at the stars, steer by the feel of the wind on my cheeks, study the birds, waves and flotsam, and meet some great people, one of whom you are about to meet. In that time, I had the book turned down by 9 publishers and was wondering whether I was alone in thinking this a story worth telling. Then came my lucky break. I showed a draft of the book to a good friend, Simon MacDonald. 2/3 of the way through that draft, Simon fired back an enthusiastic email. Reading your book inspired me to seriously consider starting a new charitable trust to buy a Polynesian double canoe. The idea is to appeal to young Māori and Polynesian kids and take them on 7 to 10 day voyages on big wakas so that they can be inspired by the achievements of their ancestors and gain pride, dignity, and identity. I am prepared to put $2 to $3 million into the venture and wonder if you would like to be involved. Simon is a man with a big heart and a big pocket, as you can see. He is also a man of action. I promptly went ahead with his bold plan. Now I knew I was not the only one who saw a story here. There were at least 2 of us now. To my delight, news of Simon's stunning initiative was soon followed up by publishing offers from both University of Hawaii Press in Honolulu and David Bateman Press in Auckland. The resulting book, Pathway of the Birds, was duly launched in 2018 aboard Hinemoana, that very same twin-hulled sailing waka, or waka haurua, that Simon had bought. And this is the very same waka that you will see proudly featured on the book's cover today, and which is now being used just as Simon envisaged, to give young Māori and others a chance to experience voyaging. And here is a brief clip from their promotional video.
For the last 5 years, the sailing waka Hinemoana has travelled across the Pacific Ocean as part of an international fleet reviving the knowledge of their voyaging ancestors. Now she has returned home, and we're offering you the unique opportunity to be part of a life-changing sailing adventure.
So, what did I learn from my own journey? For sure, the most important thing would be this: that settling the Pacific is one of the greatest achievements of humankind, an accomplishment that the dominant culture has been reluctant to celebrate or even acknowledge. But now, largely due to a renaissance in traditional voyaging craft like Hinemoana, the tide is finally turning, and is surely only a matter of time before the global significance of this achievement is widely recognized. The book was not written in isolation. Hundreds of people helped. One man stood by me throughout, and I would not have got this far without him. Thank you, David. E hara taku toa, e takitai, e toa takatini. I acknowledge that my journey is not one that I walk alone. It is one that involves many. The book has done well too. It is already in its 3rd printing and has won critical acclaim both locally and overseas, and 4 awards, including Best New Zealand History Book of the Year. Now, I would like to pass you over to fellow New Zealander Annie Black, who you see here aboard the waka that Simon bought. She has the distinction, as you know, of being one of the very few who have sailed from New Zealand to East Island without navigational instruments. In short, she has the courage to do what I have merely tried to research and write about. With the help of modern satellites, she will be talking to you from Auckland. But before I pass you over, I would like to share with you a Māori song that speaks of love, faith, and peace for all people. It's called Te Aroha.
Te aroha, te whakapono, me te rangi Māori e tātou tātou e. Te aroha, te whakapono, me te rangi Māori e tātou tātou e.
Here's Annie.
Kia ora. Tēnā no tātou, tēnā koutou, ngā tangata o te ao, nei rā tēnei e mihi atu nei ki a koutou mai Aotearoa. Warm greetings to you all from around the world. My name's Annie Black, and I was privileged to take part in an epic voyage from Aotearoa to Rappanui and home again. I just want to acknowledge Andrew and how gracious and humble he is, and embracing of me as well over the last year or two that we've known each other. And this has all come about quite organically, as we have talked about recently. In fact, that I had attended some of Andrew's past book presentations and then been offered an opportunity to speak about my voyaging experience. So just going to keep talking because there's no one talking back to me, so I'll continue. But the opportunity that was afforded me in 2012 was the brainchild, I guess, or the dream and aspirations of a gentleman who I guess rebirthed the whole renaissance of not only voyaging and navigation, but also carving voyaging canoe, sea voyaging canoe. And his name was Sir Hector Busby, who hailed from the north of the North Island. I was very privileged and fortunate to have been able to ride the wave, as we would say. It was a dream born out of 30 years of research and hard slog and networking and just a whole lot of things that went into making that voyage happen. And so in 2012, I was privileged to, along with 19 other crew, to sail from Auckland Viaduct. We left Auckland Viaduct on the 17th of August 2012, which is kind of the tail end of our winter here. And for those people who sail, they would know that the Southern Ocean is known for its rough conditions. But according to the research that had been undertaken in the previous 15 years by our navigator Jack Thatcher, this was the time that we were supposed to leave. Just want to acknowledge Jack Thatcher. He hails from Tauranga Moana, Ngā Pōtiki, Ngāi Te Rangi Nui, Ona Iwi. His tribes are from Tauranga Moana, and he was inspirational to my being included as crew on the voyage. So we left from Auckland, and the plan was the two canoes sailed together. We had two canoes that were built using traditional methods, also using modern technology, but built in a traditional construction. So the hulls were kauri, and kauri is a tree here, a native tree, and the nature of the way they were lashed together meant that we didn't use screws and nails and that sort of thing. They were lashed by binding. We used nylon ropes and modern technology for that. So the nature of these canoes were that they moved very slowly in the water, averaging around 5 knots, and but could get up to a good 12 knots down swells before things started to shake and shudder quite a lot. So the canoe would sit quite low in the water, slow boat to China kind of progression, but you know they would never sink because they were kauri, timber. Our canoe sailed together. One canoe, Te Aurere, was the lead canoe and was crewed by 10 men. Now, this was something that Sir Hector Busby had initiated in terms of traditional protocol. He wanted it to remain as a canoe to arrive to Rappanui under the power of our male crew. The other canoe which I was on, Ngāhi Raka Mai Tawhiti, which was named after Hector's second wife, that was a mixed crew, so there were male and female crew members aboard. So we ventured off, and the Southern Ocean being the gnarliest part of, I think, the Pacific Ocean, we ran into 4 storms on our first leg. Our first leg to Tubuai in French Polynesia was supposed to take 25, 26 days. We ended up being on the water for 43 days. And that was because of the 4 storms that we'd run into along our way. And although they were really testing and trying, that was my favorite leg of the whole voyage, because it really enabled you to seek out your own courage and challenge your own abilities and resilience. So I'm very grateful to have been involved in being able to experience that. And the oceans would be 7-meter swells, huge valleys, huge mountain peaks. We couldn't outrun them, so we just put out our anchors, our sea anchors, and let the sea have its way with us until the storm subsided. Once the storm subsided, it may have been a whole day before we could find the other canoe and get back on track. So how it transpired was Te Aurere, the lead canoe, was using traditional navigation as our tool to find Rappanui, which is Easter Island. And our canoe, the support canoe, we had GPS, and we had all this, both canoe had GPS and all the safety navigational equipment, etc. But the lead canoe was using traditional nav solely. So that's the stars, the moon, the sun, the swells, as Andrew has explained earlier. And we were just there as a safety precaution should we need need that help at some point. So Jack, the master navigator who trained under Nainoa Thompson, who trained under Mau Pialog, he is one of maybe 5 Po navigator at the time. And so he would check in with the captain from the navigator on Te Aurere at the end of each day, and they would do their calculations and justifications and work out whether we're still heading in the right direction. So, you know, we saw a whole lot of wondrous things along the way. It was a great social experiment, really, to put pretty much 10 strangers onto a toothpick and sail them around the Pacific. And so we had 2 toothpicks out there in the middle of the Pacific, off on this epic journey to discover an island that was over, I don't even know what the distance is, but closer to South America than any other landmass. So yeah, we were just blown away every land. We actually landed in Tubuai, and we were greeted by the people there, and it was amazing because you could really feel the connection and you could understand the language as well. So we came to realize, had a real knowledge of the connection between the islands, and that the ocean is a highway. It doesn't divide us. It actually provides a highway to connect us all together. And the next island that we came across, which was Mangareva. So when we got up to Tubuai, the currents and the winds were more settled, and it was kind of like what you call champagne sailing, which means you can just sit out there and sunbathe and have a good time and hang out in the sun until you had to do your duties. So when we arrived in Mangareva, it was even more notable that the language was more similar to us than Tubuai. And eventually when we did arrive to Rappanui, the language is just so similar that although their other language is Spanish and ours is English, we spoke in our native tongues to communicate with each other. And it was just really, really touching and a huge experience. On our arrival to Rappanui, we actually arrived early. We were like 1 week early. So we had to sit outside in the bay of Anakena, which is their beach there, and watch everybody have barbecues and parties and swim on the shore while we waited to be welcomed. And also while we were waiting for our chief to arrive from Aotearoa to Rappanui. So that was a huge experience in itself. But one thing I really remember is that when our waka are the canoe. We call them waka. We don't call them boats. Boat is like a square word. It's either a canoe or a waka. And so when our canoe beached up on the shores of Anakena, you could feel like shards of energy just driving through the bow into the land and connecting our tupuna, our ancestors, with their ancestors. And it was very palatable, that feeling. And I'm very happy to have been able to experience that. Anyway, I feel like I'm rambling on to myself, and I'm quite happy to start taking any questions if you are, Andrew.
Yes, sure. But you're not rambling on. It's
sorry.
all fascinating.
It's just that I'm talking to myself. So
well, I'm
it is
listening.
difficult. We really enjoyed it. It's wrapped. We are wrapped at attention, even though you can't see us and the 142 people who are watching you. So please, folks, I do have, let's see, Margi, I'll let you take over on the Q&A. I think there's one already, and I know we will be getting more. So you're muted, Margi. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I just like to say that Annie, everything you said is just so supportive of what Andrew was saying. I think you had a totally rapt audience.
Yeah.
It's just very moving, so thank you. So starting with questions, Mina Baker wants to know, do you think there's any relationship between Maori totem poles and Northwest Indian totem poles?
So, Annie, do you want to answer that or shall I?
No, I think most of those questions are for you.
Okay. Well, I don't actually know of any correct connection there. I'm aware of the similarity, but what I do think is that there is almost certainly some link between Polynesia and the Americas. I mean, we know that from South America, but I think also in North America, it's very likely because of the driftwood that's arriving from the redwoods that tend to arrive in the Hawaiian Islands. I think it's very obvious that there's land in that direction. And considering how far Polynesians voyaged, it would be surprising if they didn't reach North America. But as to the connection with the totem poles, I can't comment. I don't know.
Somebody asks in the chat, will this be recorded? And I think this is a good time to just simply say that people who are not on the call or who would like to share this are on the Zoom meeting and would like to share the webinar with their family or friends. It's going to be on YouTube on the Sarasota Audubon YouTube channel. And please feel free to refer people to that.
I'll type a link to the web page so they can find it. It will be up in a couple of days.
Great.
Yes.
Great. So let's see, more questions. I'm still seeing all the greetings come in. Let me just
go to Q&A, right?
There weren't so many before, but there's more showing up now. Yes. Okay. So Jacqueline Sulik says, great experience, Annie. As sailor, I am totally engrossed. Did you see birds or other signs that Andrew described? Did you have an ornithologist or other science folks on board?
Okay, so no, we were a bunch of Māori people reliving our ancestral practices, and I might add that that our ancestors, and not only our ancestors, but those of Tonga and Samoa and around the Pacific, really did connect with the environment, and that is how we were able to move so freely around the Pacific. It was because all that knowledge throughout generations was stored in stories and in song and in prayer, chants, and all that information was passed down through generations. So just in terms of the Thor Heyerdahl experience, we were actually our voyage was purposely created to debunk that and prove that our traditional knowledge was valid and real. And so that we were able to do by way of using the stars. I did forget to mention that when we were off the shore when we sighted Rappanui, which is Easter Island, it would have been about 2 in.m. And there, if you know Orion's belt, there are a couple of stars that I forgot the word, but there are 2 stars that when they reach their zenith in the sky, which is their highest point in the sky, then that was to indicate that we would see the island underneath them. And that happened. And we were really blessed that we were able to experience that. So Another thing that had happened a couple of days out from reaching Rappanui was a little blackbird had flown onto the lead canoe, and it just sat there. It sat there for 2 days, and the guys were feeding it and they were considering what to do with the bird, but they let him sit there because they understood that in our culture, when that type of thing happens, there's a reason for it, and it's an ancestor who's come to guide you. So this little blackbird flew off the morning that we sighted Rappanui and flew towards the island. And that was one of the experiences that were that was very spiritual. We also had a bird fly into our sail and kind of get disoriented for a day. And so we put it in a crate, turned the crate upside down and tried to give it some water and just let it recover from its trauma before releasing it. None of us knew what kind of bird it was, because we're not scientific people per se. Yeah.
Great.
So Mimi George asked, do you know what the current populations and distributions of frigate birds are recently compared to hundreds of years ago?
No, I don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure if that question might be for me, maybe, but I don't know the answer to that.
So my sister is on and has a question for Andrew. Does the adjective swell, quote unquote, originate from the ocean terminology you described?
Not that I know of. I don't know the etymology. Sorry.
Sure.
And,
You know what I do know though? I did my offshore skipper's license last year, and one of the symbols for when a ship runs aground, it is 3 balls. That's the day signal that you would display to show that a ship is run aground. And that saying that comes, that saying that it's a balls up, that comes from that. I learnt that during the course.
Interesting.
The balls up.
Thank you.
So Annie, on your return voyage, did you follow a similar course as on the first voyage to Rappanui? And that's asked by Francis Lynn Paranois.
Right. So, excuse me. No, we went through French Polynesia, Tubuai, Mangarewa, up to Rappanui, and then we went higher. We went through the Tuamotus down to Tahiti, and we stayed in Tahiti 2 months to wait out the hurricane season. And then from Tahiti, we set sail for Rarotonga and then home again.
Can you describe how anchor canoe at sea during storms? What does this entail, according to Meredith McKinley?
Okay, now this is the funny bit, because on our voyage back into the country, on our last leg from Rarotonga to Aotearoa to New Zealand, we had another storm. There were storms all over the place, but mainly exiting and entering. Anyway, this particular storm was pretty gnarly, and so we had to put out our sea anchors. And a sea anchor is like a parachute, and it just holds you not directly into the swell, but on an angle so that the canoe kind of cuts through the swell, and it holds you on that line so you're not broached to the swell and it would capsize you. Well, what happened this particular storm is that we put out our sea anchor. Within a few hours, the ropes had snapped. We'd lost the sea anchor. We then deployed one of our storm sails that we kind of curved around to make it feel like a sea anchor. And so we stuck that out, and a few hours later, the rope snapped and that one was gone.
Oh,
So we were kind of running out of things to throw overboard, and we had discussed throwing people overboard, but that wasn't going to wash too well with everyone. So we ended up filling up we had these big 20-litre water containers. So we filled up 10 of those, tied them together, chucked them overboard, and waited. And by this time, it's like 3 a.m. And so we're kind of in the dark, wondering whether our anchors are going to hold and wondering what we're going to tie up next to throw overboard if that was to fail. Fortunately for us, the storm subsided before morning. We did lose those containers, but because the storm had already started to subside, it wasn't such a risk for us.
wow.
Wow.
Wow. Meredith asks another question. Where can we see a close-up of the canoe, living quarters, etc.? What did you eat at sea?
So we took a lot of dry stock, and we didn't have any refrigeration, just the chili bins. So we had all our meats and things frozen and put in chili bins with sea salt. Now that was only going to last us 2 weeks before everything defrosted and warmed up and spoiled. So after that point, we had canned foods. We had plenty of, we'd stocked the canoe with rice and with grains to last the whole voyage. So that wasn't the issue. But what became an issue was that we did run out of water. So we started collecting the rainwater because of the storms that we were having. But more importantly, we didn't have enough cooking gas fuel on board. So we started to ration cooking to one meal a day. And because we were down to things like rice, you can't really eat that raw. And so, yeah, we were just trying to ration water and our fuel to cook with by the end of our 43-day leg.
Crazy.
Yeah.
So Mike Doobie asks, is there a Maori TV or radio channel in New Zealand?
There are several. They are localized through the different districts, towns in New Zealand. Yeah. Māori TV, we have 2 channels dedicated to Māori programs, and there are a number of radio stations dedicated to Māori programs, content.
So, Richard Baker asks, how many women do this? How did you get involved with this activity?
All my stars aligned and the magical pathway opened up and I jumped on the canoe. There's no rhyme nor reason. It was just meant to be.
I'd like to ask you, myself, I'd like to ask you, are you like 100% Maori, or what is your heritage? And I mean this with great respect. I'm fascinated with different lineages, even among Western peoples, but can you tell us a little bit more about your heritage? And
I probably should have done that at the beginning when I didn't really introduce myself. So I'm my two grandfathers. One was Chinese, full Chinese, and the other was full Cornish, came from Cornwall. And my 2 grandmothers were a mixture of predominantly Māori, but also English and Scottish. So that's my lineage. And I'm very proud of all of it.
oh, I think you should be. And are you fluent in Maori? Do you live in Maori, or?
Yeah, so I'm fluent in speaking Māori, second language learner, so not native tongue. And I'm also a a teacher of Te Reo Māori, of Māori language. So I'm a primary school teacher who has taught in Māori language speaking schools.
Wow.
Mm.
And is that your primary occupation overall?
It was until I became a Voyager, and then that just kind of stuffs everything else up.
And do you continue to voyage now in your own way or your own?
I'm voyaging on the inside at the moment. I still need to find a real canoe.
Wow, so inspiring. Let me go back to questions here. Let me just scroll down.
Allison Williams has an interesting one.
You mentioned briefly about the impact of the energy of connection you experienced of ancestors' history. And this person says she's not sure your exact words. As the waka finally hit the shore in Rappanui, could you speak a little more about that? What was happening? Yes, I
guess it was just a feeling of like light energy. And as soon as the hulls of the canoe slipped up onto the sand, you know, you could just feel this energy flash through those hulls into the land and probably out the other side of the island. And it was just like, we're home.
Wow. And was everybody on that canoe, most everybody on that canoe, were they Maori? Or Maori?
Yes, mixed descent. But there aren't any full Māori descent anymore. We're all mixed descent, but yes, we were all identify as being Māori.
Understand that. My sister wants to know, did you encounter any floating plastic islands on the sea?
No, that's apparently further up towards the equator.
I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but good for you that you didn't have to see it.
Yeah.
Matt Rayner wants to know, what cultural protocols did you have to do through leaving Aotearoa and arriving at Rappanui?
Okay, so we have a ceremony called basically we have a lot of prayers that we bless the people, bless the canoe, bless and ask for our ancestors to guide us, that sort of thing. So we have a ceremony that we perform, not so publicly, but our farewell was a very public event. And so that was also reflected in that farewell. And when we reached Rappanui, we have a welcoming through Polynesia that we call it a pōheri here in Aotearoa in New Zealand. And it's a welcoming. And it's when we bring our ancestors, they bring their ancestors, and not only do we meet in flesh, but our ancestors meet through us. And so when we got to Rappanui, the home crowd, what they had actually done, which we didn't know for about a week, that they had, because they're not allowed to practice their traditional, their traditions. And so they had gone to the museum and stolen the eyes, you know, the Moai statues, those big Rappanui heads, that they had gone and stolen the eyes, borrowed the eyes of their ancestors so that they could perform their rituals and bring their ancestors back to life by replacing the eyes. So when we got there, there was dancing, there was singing. The home people made a pyramid of men, and two men climbed up the pyramid to the top where they placed the eyes back into their ancestor. And by doing that, they awoke him. He was awoken. and was able to greet us and our ancestors. And we didn't actually realize that they had broken their
taboo or
laws.
something.
Yeah.
I've got a picture of that occasion. I've got a picture of that occasion if you'd like to see it. I don't know if you can see this.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a
And it's
picture
just
from that
amazing.
moment that Annie's describing. So there's
Yeah.
people climbing all over the statues.
Amazing.
Wow.
And so what had happened after that is that the the police were looking for somebody to arrest, but nobody was saying anything. The eyes were returned, and our traditions were upheld.
Wow. You know, just commenting as the person that invited you both, I don't have any even American Indian heritage, but I find myself moved to tears, and my partner here watching also. I feel moved to tears by the whole presentation. It's like, and your connection to your ancestors is just so moving to me. I'm so grateful that you share your heart, both of you share your hearts in this. This is really a moving presentation. Very, very powerful. Betsy Anderson wants to know, what was your greatest surprise or discovery on the voyage?
I've said this at a couple of Andrew's presentations, but the journey on the inside far outreached the journey on the outside in terms of getting to know me. And yeah, that was my greatest discovery.
And how do you see can you articulate? I mean, you sort of have been articulating all along, but how has it changed you on the inside?
I think you realize how courageous how much courage you do have. Through that first leg, which was the most trying of our legs of the voyage, you learn about yourself, about your resilience, about how much strength you do have, determination, wonderment, because you realize how small you are in the middle of the Pacific. There was one time where our two canoe nearly collided, and that was because the steering blade of Te Aurere had snapped, and they just started to career towards us. They missed us by a meter. In the whole of the Pacific Ocean, we had this near miss. And you know, it really, you realize how small and insignificant you are in the scheme of things, but also you realize you're also pretty important to some people out there as well.
Maybe it's not by accident that you end up connecting so closely. I'd just really like to thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I feel so moved by what you both have presented and shared with us. I feel like there's a real reach between the Gulf Ocean here and around South America into the Pacific. And you've really reinforced that for all of us. So thank you so much.
And you know, Margi, it wouldn't have happened without you.
Well, thank you. I feel I'm so thrilled this worked out, and it was meant to be because it wasn't hard to do. And I've gotten so much help from Sarasota Audubon and Jean Doobie and Karen Willie. So thank you so much, all of you. This is really wonderful. I'm just shedding tears of joy and emotion being moved by all that you've shared. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. And Margi, can we put a plug in for our next
Yes.
program?
I'd just like to say that can you remind me of the date, Karen? I think it's the 8th of March.
It is the 8th,
Second Monday
of March, Monday
Yes.
the 8th.
So kind of fitting in a way. We're going to have the Western perspective, and they're actually personal mentors of mine, Ken Meyer and Gina Kent, who, among other things, are ornithologists and researchers using transmitters on different birds that are imperiled here in Florida and in the southeastern United States. And they use the tracking devices to study them and to advise people on their management, and conservation. And specifically, the title of the talk will be Tracking Data-Driven Habitat Management and Conservation for Imperiled Florida Birds. And they're going to focus on the snail kites and reddish egrets, which are birds that are threatened here. And among other things, they're famous for putting transmitters on these imperiled birds and tracking them the new scientific way. So,
All right.
so we look forward to having you there. And thank you again for
Thank you so much, Andrew and Ani.
wonderful presentation.
Fantastic. Yes.
You're welcome. Noho ora mai. Ka kite anō.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, thank you.
And we will send you the link for YouTube when it's available, so you can share with your friends. Yes.
Thank you.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Okay.